The forward operating base shook under sheets of horizontal rain, the kind of weather that turned runways into mirrors and radios into static. Inside the cramped operations tent, a colonel slammed his palm against the briefing table, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "I need a combat pilot. Right now? Any combat pilots here who've flown low-level in weather like this?" The room fell silent. 3 young lieutenants looked at their boots. A maintenance chief shook his head. 2 contractors edged toward the door. Standing near the back, half-shadowed by a hanging map, was a quiet woman in a faded flight suit, her dark hair pulled tight, her hands resting calmly on a worn helmet bag. Nobody looked at her. Nobody asked. The colonel's eyes swept past her twice. Then a young sergeant noticed something. A small embroidered patch on her shoulder, half hidden beneath her jacket, that read "Hog Driver" in stitched gold thread. And a thin pale scar curving along her jaw that only ejection seats leave behind. She lifted her radio and said, softly, 6 words no civilian would ever say in that order. "2 ship cold, guns hot. Push it." The colonel froze. Tell me honestly in the comments, should courage be judged by how someone looks, or only by what they prove when everything is on the line? Long before she ever wore a flight suit, Maya Reyes was a small girl in a small town in eastern Arizona, where the sky was bigger than anything else in her life. Her father worked nights at a regional airfield, and her mother stitched uniforms for the local guard unit. So the smell of jet fuel and starched fabric was woven into her earliest memories. She grew up watching A-10 warthogs from Davis-Monthan thunder across the desert during training runs, their twin engines rumbling like a heartbeat she could feel in her chest. While other children chased each other through dry creek beds, Maya laid flat on her back in the dirt, tracking contrails with her fingertip and whispering call signs she had heard her father use on the radio. She built her first model aircraft at 7, a clumsy plastic F-16 with crooked decals, and by 10 she could name every fighter in the U.S. inventory by silhouette alone. Her bedroom walls became a quiet museum of aviation, squadron patches her father traded for, photographs torn from old issues of Air Force magazine, and a hand-drawn diagram of a cockpit instrument panel she had copied from a library book. Teachers said she was bright but distracted, always staring out the window when the afternoon training flights crossed overhead. Her mother understood. Her father understood. Most others did not. When she was 12, a visiting career counselor came to her middle school and asked the children what they wanted to be. Maya raised her hand without hesitation and said she wanted to fly an A-10 in combat. The counselor smiled the way adults smile when they think a child has misunderstood the world, and told her gently that combat aviation was a tough road, especially for girls, and perhaps she might consider becoming a flight attendant or an air traffic controller instead. The classroom laughed. A boy in the back row made engine noises and pretended to crash his hand into the desk. Maya did not cry. She simply lowered her hand and wrote one sentence in her notebook. "I will fly anyway." That sentence followed her through high school, through 2 failed attempts at the local flying club scholarship, and through a brutal summer working at a feed store to save money for ground school. Her father, sensing the weight she carried, sat with her one evening on the back porch as a distant warthog crossed the dusk. He told her something she would carry into every cockpit for the rest of her life. He said pilots are not born from talent alone, but from the stubbornness to keep showing up when the world keeps telling them to leave. He said the sky does not care about your gender, your last name, or your accent. The sky only asks if you have done your homework. Maya nodded, watching the aircraft fade into the orange horizon, and quietly promised herself she would never stop doing her homework. The road from a small Arizona town to a military cockpit is paved with exhaustion, and Maya learned that lesson within her first week of officer training. She had earned an ROTC slot at a state university, balancing an aerospace engineering degree with pre-dawn physical training, drill formations, and a stack of regulations thick enough to use as a doorstop. Her instructors were not cruel, but they were unforgiving, and they made it clear that a flight slot was not promised to anyone, no matter how hard they wanted it. She failed her first land navigation course. She failed her first oral board. She rewrote her study notes 3 times until her handwriting bled into the margins, and she passed the second attempts with quiet, measured confidence. Undergraduate pilot training at Vance Air Force Base was where the dream became a discipline. Maya learned that flying was not about freedom. It was about checklists, call-outs, configuration changes, energy management, and the relentless pursuit of standardization. She memorized boldface emergency procedures until she could recite them in her sleep, and on more than one night her roommate found her whispering engine fire steps into the dark. Her early simulator sessions were humbling. She over-controlled the stick, chased the airspeed needle, and once entered a botched traffic pattern so badly that her instructor pulled the headset off and asked her, calmly, whether she had eaten breakfast. She had not. She never made that mistake again. Fear arrived in many forms. There was the fear of the centrifuge, where she had to fight to stay conscious under 9 times the force of gravity, learning the hook maneuver to keep blood in her brain. There was the fear of the altitude chamber, where she felt her fingers go numb and her vision narrow before she snapped her oxygen mask back into place. And there was the quieter fear of the grade book, where every sortie was scored, every error logged, and every weakness flagged in red ink. Some classmates washed out. One was medically grounded after a hard ejection seat training incident. Maya kept her head down, kept her notes neat, and kept showing up. What surprised her most was how much of flying happened on the ground. She learned the names of every crew chief, every weapons loader, and every avionics technician on her flight line. Because she had grown up understanding that pilots do not fly aircraft alone. They fly the trust of dozens of unseen hands. She brought coffee to the night shift. She listened when an experienced sergeant explained why a particular hydraulic line tended to leak in cold weather. She learned that a pilot who treats the ground crew as equals will always be safer than a pilot who treats them as servants. When she finally pinned on her silver wings, her hands shook only slightly. She had earned a slot in the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the close air support aircraft her father had taught her to recognize from a mile away. The track selection officer told her the Warthog community was tight, demanding, and old school. He said she would have to prove herself twice as fast and half as loud as anyone else. Maya stood at attention, looked him in the eye, and said only, "Yes, sir." Inside, she was already doing her homework. Her first operational assignment was to a Warthog squadron stationed overseas, a unit with a long combat lineage and a clubhouse culture that did not bend easily for newcomers. The squadron building smelled of coffee, jet fuel, and decades of accumulated bravado. Photographs of past commanders lined the hallway, every face male, every gaze fixed on the camera, as if daring time itself to move on. Maya checked in with her squadron commander, saluted crisply, and was assigned a desk in the corner of the scheduling office, beside a printer that nobody had cleaned since the previous deployment. The hostility she encountered was not loud. It rarely is. There were no slurs, no shoves, no openly cruel remarks. Instead, there was a quieter pattern. The way her name was sometimes left off the flight schedule until she asked twice. The way her tactical suggestions in the mass briefing were greeted with polite nods and then quietly ignored. The way certain flight leads always seemed to pair her with the same lukewarm wingmen on the slowest training missions. She noticed it. She did not complain. She wrote it down in her green notebook, the same way she had written every lesson since middle school. She made her presence felt the only way she knew how, by being unimpeachable. She arrived at the squadron 40 minutes before every brief, with her lineup cards already drawn and her threat updates already memorized. She studied the local terrain charts until she could close her eyes and trace the ridgelines from memory. When her flight lead asked an obscure question about the gun's effective slant range against light armor, she answered before the senior captain could finish reaching for his kneeboard. The room went briefly quiet. Then the conversation moved on, as it always did, but something had shifted, and a few of the older pilots began to look at her differently. Her crew chief, a wiry sergeant named Daniels who had been turning wrenches on Warthogs since before Maya could drive, became one of her quietest allies. He noticed how she walked the jet during pre-flight, not as a performance, but as a conversation. She would tap a panel, listen, and ask him whether the new fuel transfer pump was holding pressure. She would thank him by name when she stepped down the boarding ladder. On a cold morning when her aircraft developed a fuel leak on the ramp, she stayed beside him in the wind until the issue was resolved. and she signed off the maintenance forms herself rather than handing them to a junior airman to file. Daniels did not say much, but he started saving her aircraft tail number 217 for every sortie he could. Still, the pressure to be perfect was relentless. A male pilot who flew an average sortie was forgotten by lunch. Maya knew that an average sortie from her would be discussed in the bar that night, so she did not fly average sorties. She flew prepared once. She studied the weather brief before she studied the tasking. She memorized the Joint Terminal Attack Controller's voice on the radio, so she could distinguish stress from fatigue. She learned, slowly, that being underestimated was not always a wound. Sometimes, in the right cockpit, it was a quiet kind of armor. The mission that changed everything began as an ordinary tasking, the way most defining moments in aviation do. A coalition ground convoy escorting a medical evacuation team had been ambushed in a narrow valley along the eastern frontier, and the weather over the engagement area was deteriorating into something the meteorologists called marginal, which everyone in the squadron understood to mean barely flyable. A line of thunderstorms was rolling in from the north. Ceilings were dropping below 1,000 feet, and the mountain ridges that bordered the valley were already swallowed in gray. The original close air support package, a pair of fighters from a partner unit, had been forced to abort due to fuel and icing concerns. The Joint Terminal Attack Controller on the ground was a young sergeant named Holcomb, and his radio calls were tightening with every passing minute. The convoy had taken casualties. A vehicle was disabled. The medical evacuation helicopter could not approach until the threat was suppressed and the weather lifted, and the weather was not going to lift before nightfall. In the operations tent, the colonel paced the floor and asked the question Maya had heard 1,000 times in her life. Who was qualified? Who was current? Who was willing? The answer was thin. Half the squadron was already on a tanker hours away. The other half was grounded by crew rest or scheduled maintenance. Maya was current. She was rested. She had flown that valley 3 times in the last month, 2 of them in instrument conditions. And she had spent the previous evening rehearsing emergency divert profiles in the simulator because she liked the way the routine cleared her head before sleep. When the colonel finally turned and saw her standing near the map with her helmet bag at her feet, he hesitated for half a second, long enough for her to feel every quiet exclusion of the past year compress into a single moment. And then he simply said her call sign, Ripsaw, and asked if she could take the mission with a wingman. She said yes. She did not say it loudly. She said it the way pilots say things when they understand exactly what they are agreeing to. Her wingman, a mid-grade captain named Boyd who had flown with her twice before, nodded once and reached for his gear without comment. The intelligence officer briefed the threat picture in clipped sentences: small arms, possibly a heavy machine gun, a suspected man-portable air defense system somewhere along the southern ridge. The weather officer briefed embedded thunderstorms, severe turbulence below 5,000 feet, and a forecast that was already wrong by the time he finished reading it. Maya did not flinch. She drew her lineup card with a steady hand, calculated her bingo fuel for 3 different divert fields, and walked out to the jet beside Boyd as the first heavy drops began to streak the ramp. Daniels was already waiting at tail number 217, the canopy open, the inlet covers off, the chocks pulled. He handed her the forms and said only, "She's tight, ma'am. Bring her home." Maya nodded, climbed the ladder, and settled into the cockpit. She had earned 1 checklist at a time. The storm flickered on the horizon like a wall of slow lightning. She lowered her visor, set her radios, and began the start sequence with the same calm cadence she had used on her very first solo, years and a lifetime ago. The takeoff roll was rough but disciplined. Maya rotated into a wall of low cloud within seconds, her instruments her only horizon, her hands light on the stick the way her instructors had drilled into her since pilot training. Boyd checked in on the tactical frequency, his aircraft a faint shadow in formation off her right wing. And together they pushed eastward toward the valley at the lowest safe altitude the terrain would allow. Turbulence punched the airframe in irregular bursts. Rain hammered the canopy. She did not fight the aircraft. She flew it, gently, the way Daniels had once told her a good pilot flies a tired jet, like you are asking it for a favor, not giving it an order. She talked to Boyd in short, clean phrases. Let is pushing. 2 is visual. Let is going IMC. Take spacing. Every transmission was deliberate, every pause measured. She knew that radio discipline in weather like this was the difference between coordinated combat aviation and two aircraft becoming statistics on the same ridgeline. As they neared the valley, she contacted the Joint Terminal Attack Controller and listened for the things he was not saying. The slight tremor at the edge of his voice. The way he repeated the friendly position twice instead of once. She acknowledged calmly, read back the 9-line brief without error, and confirmed the restricted operating zone for the inbound medical helicopter. The first pass was a show of presence, low and slow along the northern ridge, the Warthog's signature rumble cutting through the storm. She did not fire. She did not need to. She used the pass to confirm the friendly position visually, to identify the threat axis, and to update Boyd on the cloud bases, which were lower than briefed. She climbed, repositioned, and cross-checked her fuel. She had less margin than she liked. She spoke the number aloud to Boyd so that 2 pilots, not 1, were tracking the bingo. She had learned long ago that fuel awareness is not a calculation. It is a conversation. When the situation on the ground required suppressive fire, she rolled in with the controlled aggression her gunnery instructors had spent years building into her muscle memory. She used the gun, briefly and precisely, against the identified threat position, with friendly forces marked, cleared hot, and visual. She did not fire on the second pass, because the geometry was wrong and the risk to the convoy was higher than the benefit. She climbed, reset, and tried again from a different axis. Boyd covered her egress. The controller's voice steadied. The convoy began to move. The weather worsened. A microburst rolled across the valley floor, and Maya felt the aircraft sink in a way that made her stomach tighten. But her hands did exactly what her hands had been trained to do. Power up, attitude first, no abrupt inputs. She climbed out of it. She did not panic. She told Boyd. She told the controller. She told her fuel gauge, in a small private way, that they were going home together. When the medical helicopter finally pushed into the valley under a brief weather window, Maya orbited overhead at minimum safe altitude, eyes outside, eyes inside, eyes on her wingman. Eyes on her fuel. She did not fire another round. She stayed until the wounded were aboard. Only then did she turn west, lined up on the divert field, and call, simply, Ripsaw Flight, RTB. She landed in driving rain at an austere divert strip, taxied carefully on a slick ramp, and shut the engines down with the same deliberate cadence she had started them. The crew chief who marshaled her in was not Daniels. She was a young airman from another unit, soaked through her coveralls, eyes wide as she chalked the wheels of an aircraft she had only ever seen in photographs. Maya climbed down the ladder, removed her helmet, and shook the young airman's hand before saying anything else. She thanked her by name. The airman would tell that story for the rest of her career. The debrief was long, the way good debriefs always are. Maya walked through every decision, every radio call, every fuel check, every moment she had chosen restraint over aggression. She praised Boyd's discipline. She praised the controller's composure. She praised Daniels, by name and tail number, for sending her into the storm with an aircraft that never gave her a reason to doubt it. When the squadron commander asked whether she had felt afraid, she paused, then answered honestly. She said fear had been there, the entire flight, sitting quietly in the seat behind her, but that fear had not been driving. Training had been driving. Procedure had been driving. The people who had taught her, fueled her, armed her, and trusted her had been driving. Word of the mission spread quickly, in the way these things do in small aviation communities. The convoy commander called the squadron and asked, by name, for the pilot with the call sign Ripsaw, because his men wanted to know who had stayed overhead and whether no one had any business flying in. The colonel who had once looked past her in the operations tent walked into the squadron bar that night, found her sitting quietly with a cup of coffee, and shook her hand without a speech. He did not need a speech. Everyone in the room understood. The lieutenants who had once let her name fall off the schedule began asking to fly on her wing. The senior captains who had once nodded politely at her tactical inputs began writing her suggestions down. Daniels, when she returned to her home base, simply patted the nose of tail number 217 and said, "Told you she was tight." Maya laughed, and it was the first easy laugh she had allowed herself in a long time. She did not change. She still arrived 40 minutes early to every brief. She still studied the weather before the tasking. She still thanked her ground crew by name and signed her own forms. When younger pilots, including a quiet first-year lieutenant who reminded her painfully of herself, asked her how she had earned the respect of the squadron, Maya gave the same answer every time. She said she had not earned respect. She had simply done her job the way she had been taught, by people who had believed in her long before anyone else did. She said that real service was not a performance, and that real respect was not an applause line. She said the only audience that mattered, in the end, was the convoy on the ground and the crew chief on the ramp. She kept flying. She kept doing her homework. The sky, as her father had once promised her, did not care who she was. It only asked, every single time, whether she was ready. And every single time, Maya Reyes, call sign Ripsaw, climbed into the cockpit and quietly answered yes. Maya's story is not a story about a woman beating men in a man's world. That framing is too small for what really happened in that valley, and too small for what really happens in cockpits, on flight lines, and in operations centers every day across every branch of military aviation. Her story is about something older and quieter than gender. It is about preparation meeting opportunity. It is about discipline outlasting doubt. It is about a young girl in an Arizona desert who watched contrails cross the sky and decided, against every signal the world sent her, that she would do the homework no matter how long it took. What she learned, and what her story leaves behind for anyone willing to listen, is that courage in aviation is not loud. It does not posture. It does not announce itself in the operations tent. It sits quietly in the back of the room with a worn helmet bag at its feet, and it stands up only when someone asks the right question. Real combat aviators are made by checklists, by crew chiefs, by instructors who refuse to lower the standard, and by the thousand small choices a pilot makes when no one is watching. Maya did not fly through that storm because she was extraordinary. She flew through it because she had practiced, because she had listened, and because she had built a team around her that trusted her to bring everyone home. If her story matters, it matters because somewhere tonight another quiet woman in a flight suit is being looked past in another briefing room. She is doing her homework. She is studying the weather. She is learning the names of her ground crew. And one day, when the colonel finally turns and asks the question, she will be ready, not to prove anyone wrong, but to serve, with excellence, when lives depend on her discipline. That is the real legacy of pilots like Ripsaw. Not applause, not headlines, just the steady, humble sound of a warthog coming in low through the rain, exactly when it is needed most.